It lingered in the air like a promise, a quiet insistence that threaded through their days. Memory, braided with present sensation, the old and the new forming an intimate geography. He told her to stay with a pocketed note folded like a promise. She said yes with a hand that fit into his as if it had been waiting. Even mundane tasks, the kettle's whistle, a jar being opened, became rituals of belonging. The harbor did not calm the blaze. They learned to carry it, gentle and persistent, as one carries a lantern into a storm. He remembered the small absurdities of childhood and let them soften his voice. There was a hum of life around them, ordinary and faithful, that steadied their impatience. Listen. This is the slow work of two people who choose one another and, in choosing, teach a city how to remember. Subscribe now and become part of this unforgettable world of stories, and click the notification bell so you're among the first to hear each new light we set adrift. Aveline first saw Mateo beneath the cafe's crooked awning on a morning when the rain smoothed the city into a watercolor and the smell of coffee sunk into his coat. They learned one another with the slow care of people rebuilding something delicate and worth holding. The harbor became a witness. Gulls wheeled overhead and the sea kept its patient rhythm. He held a box of reels against his chest, the way one might keep a small animal warm, like a thing that could sleep and dream and be trusted to wake. She held that moment inside her, turning it over like a small, luminous stone. She slowed without thinking, because there was in the way he studied small things, how a child retied a shoe, how a fishmonger wrapped his catch, an affection that was not showy and therefore true. She had returned to the harbor after 10 years abroad in archives and conservation labs. The town had kept some things and lost others, but the harbor still had a way of returning objects to people as if tide and memory were in conversation. They met properly at the municipal theater where the bulbs were thrift store warm, the chairs smelled faintly of popcorn, and the projector hummed like an old friend. Aveline carried boxes of digitized tapes and the gentle authority of someone who has learned to treat other people's pasts with caution. Mateo carried tools and a lantern and the steady hands of someone who could make a machine obey. Their conversation slipped into long, comfortable silences that felt like answers more than questions. Their hands brushed over a spool of magnetic tape and the contact felt, to both, like a punctuation mark in a story that had been waiting for a voice. They turned a derelict boathouse into the harbor archive in a season of hard, patient labor. The roof leaked in winter, and in the coastal heat the kettle's whistle became a station of morning worship. The van's passenger door stuck when the sun softened the metal, the speakers rasped with personality, the shelves gathered reels labeled in slanting script that smelled faintly of lemon oil and attic dust. People came with shoeboxes and grocery bags of footage, grainy weddings, shaky markets, a child's first steps, a woman cleaning a net while humming a tune you would later find in the margins of a songbook. In the archive they cleaned sticky tape, labeled reels, translated dialects in interviews, and taught neighbors how to digitize with care. In the hush after, they would press foreheads together and map the landscape of quiet joy. Their lives braided around rituals and tiny practices that functioned like the archives. Conservation techniques. Monday nights were for transcribing. Wednesday nights for screenings where the community came with blankets and thermoses. Sunday mornings for walks along the cliff walk where they tested sound against surf and argued about the right microphone placement as if the ocean itself were a jury. They ate whatever the market offered at a dented table, argued about crediting volunteers, and wrote a pact on a napkin one rain dark night that they folded into a tin: honesty without weaponization, space without abandonment, tenderness by practice. The napkin read, in cramped hands: always ask, always listen, always return. They kept it like a relic and slipped it into pockets when days were hard. A neighbor arrived with a thermos and a story, and the archive absorbed that story as if it were its own. Romance grew not like a sudden blaze but as a series of rehearsed tendernesses, learning the exact temperature of each other's tea, the song that calmed anxiety, how to silence a startled heart with the right kind of look. They argued with the kind of ferocity that comes from shared exhaustion, and then invented repair rituals, 10-minute cool downs after fights, a truth jar for anonymous grievances, and one night a month where no work talk was permitted. These tools were domestic and mundane, but they kept erosion at bay. Mateo learned to say I need instead of folding into silence, and Aveline learned to ask for space without interpreting distance as betrayal. Their love was an apprenticeship in staying. Desire there felt like a steady tide, reliable, warm, not demanding spectacle but steady presence. Their physical life was tender and true. The archive roof was a place for stolen afternoons, blankets spread beneath sodium streetlights, cheap wine opened like a present, rain making percussive music on the tar. They made love slowly there, every touch deliberate as to conserve meaning. Their kisses were slow negotiations, wordless agreements that settled old tempers and opened new places. He memorized the map of her jaw with the back of a finger. She catalogued the small muscles at his neck and committed them to memory the way a cartographer learns coastline. Late at night, they would stand in the doorway and count the stars they could see between the rigging of old boats. They did not need an audience or a photograph, they required presence. Afterwards, Mateo would fold a tiny note and tuck the word stay into Aveline's jacket pocket, a small charm that meant as much as any ring. The archive gathered a constellation of people with weather of their own. Malik arrived first, a teenager whose grin could forgive many mistakes, who learned to solder projectors and later fixed more than machinery. He learned how to hold a room's anxiety and make it right. Rosa brought trunks of family footage and recipes scribbled in the margins. She taught younger women to cook for camera and in doing so taught a generation how to claim culinary memory as public culture. Jenna, a shy student, learned how to point a camera at the ordinary and make it luminous. She left for film school and returned to teach narrative structure in the archive's basement. A postman filmed the night routes of the city and found poetry in the ordinary. An elder brought wedding reels faded to gold and wept at seeing herself younger. The van, patched and protest sprayed, carried equipment to schoolyards and senior centers, turning small squares into screening rooms, and each return audience served as the archive's account book of trust repaid. The city brought opportunity and temptation. Orlando Ferrer was a man with uncreased suits and the language of expansion, scale, reach, impact. He admired the harbor archive and offered equipment, national airtime, and grants if the project accepted some editorial consultation to make their work presentable to sponsors. Mateo felt the prick of principle. Memories were not commodities to be polished for donors. Aveline feared the flattening of context. She had seen how a cut could turn a life into a catchy anecdote. They declined the initial offer politely and then definitively, choosing autonomy over cash, and the decision tightened the workshop's muscles. Fundraising felt sharp without the cushion of a big check. The rupture widened when a grant proposal from Orlando's team lifted language almost verbatim from the archive's curriculum. Aveline felt a cut so personal it looked like betrayal, a phrase that had been theirs, repackaged and marketed. A local reporter examined the echoes and wrote a piece that did not indict crime but exposed moral laxity. Community labor was being wrapped into a commodity without consent. Some defended Orlando. Inspiration, they said. Others felt outraged. The city argued in cafes and comment threads. For the archive, it was a test that exposed how fragile legitimacy could be when measured in logos. Something unexpected happened. Orlando came to a screening and sat in the back without notes, looking like a man trying on humility. Lucia, the municipal archivist who had taught Aveline conservation tricks and the craft of gentle curation, asked him what had led him here. He confessed a childhood memory. A teacher who had lent him a camera and trusted him with a roll of film. That small generosity had shaped the life he built. Systems, spreadsheets, perfect pitch decks, and it had never been acknowledged in his narrative. Confrontation turned into conversation, and the language of negotiation shifted. Mateo insisted on terms, funds without editorial strings, a community committee to select fellows, and all archived material to remain in the Harbor Archive's custody. Orlando agreed, awkward and genuine, and the archive gained archival boxes, a projector that cooled instead of burning, and a modest stipend for transportation for fellows. The new funds came with bureaucracy. The archive wrote bylaws and instituted rotating board seats and consent coaches who led trainings in trauma-aware interviewing. An old song from a reel would catch in Aveline's throat and she would hum it while sorting film leaders. A corrupted hard drive that once swallowed a year's work became a cautionary curriculum on redundancy and chain of custody protocols. A stolen external drive evolved into a lesson plan for security and legal recourse. They learned to convert crisis into infrastructure, backups, climate-controlled storage, and an ethics charter that guaranteed consent and context before public screenings. These bureaucratic muscles tore at some of the archive's rough charm, but they protected the very thing the project was built to defend: people's trust. Aveline and Mateo's personal story threaded through the archive's public life. They shared the kinds of domestic tenderness people misunderstand as small tea made exactly the way the other wanted. A jacket pocket note during bad mornings, the habit of making space when work demanded absence. After a fight about a volunteer's poor handling of an elder interview, Aveline walked to the cliff walk and braced against the wind. Mateo found her and did not try to fix. He sat until her breathing rearranged. He learned that staying could be the longest vow. She learned to ask for absence without meaning abandonment. They paused to watch a child chase a ribbon on the pier, and for a moment the world reduced to that small, triumphant motion. These were small practices of repair that amounted to a way of living. The archive's fellowship program grew, and with it new ethical dilemmas that tested their values. Noemi arrived with a trunk of farm footage and the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to hold silence as much as image. When a national broadcaster offered her a salaried reporting role, the archive held its breath. The job's promise glittered with financial relief and visibility. Noemi, with counsel from the Fellows Committee, negotiated a hybrid role: national reporting on terms that left certain community projects in the archives ownership, and a commitment to teach for several weeks a year at the Harbor Archive. Her choice modeled a path of hybrid expansion, you could step outward without severing roots. There were seasons of scarcity and ritualized asking. The van's brakes failed one autumn and the small email campaign they launched brought in enough for a repair and several sympathetic notes. They baked and bartered, banana bread and projection time traded for film stock, local restaurants donated soup. For screening nights, grants covered a part-time coordinator. The board learned to insist on value-aligned grants and to say no when donors required logos across materials. They made hard compromises, fund certain outreach programs without editorial interference, because survival required negotiation without surrender. Loss came and demanded ritual. Lucia grew brittle with age, and then quieter with an absence that needed a memorial. Malik won a scholarship and left for film school with a suitcase and a promise to return, when he came back years later to teach a summer program. The room clapped as if for a son. A hard drive corrupted, and they lost a reel that told a market's slow decline. The team projected a memorial reel and invited the community to remember. Mourning became an exercise in repair and redundancy, and the archive instituted a memorial series where lost footage was recounted and contextualized so absence did not erase stories. Community influence rippled outward. Mateo once left a note under a stack of reels. It was a tiny thing, but it felt like a promise kept. A neighboring town adopted the Harbor Archives Fellowship selection and consent protocols. A small festival borrowed their listening night format. A local radio show interviewed fellows who insisted that community consultation meant more than token inclusion. The archive won a modest festival prize for a short film that stitched together a seamstress's life, and that prize paid for a year's worth of climate-controlled storage. These were not overnight headlines. They were the accrual of many small returns, like interest registered in people's lives, rather than an account balance. The archive's intimate spaces were where the political softened into the personal. Lovers grew more practiced at tender gestures, a hand placed to calm, running fingers through damp hair after a storm, going to bed early so the other could finish an editing session without an exhausted audience. Sex was not performance. It was a litany of consent and presence. Fingers traced small maps on skin, not hurried but curious, cataloging the soft topography of each other. They learned to ask even in familiarity. Do you want this? Was a ritual that preserved autonomy and pleasure. They celebrated quiet sex, long mornings, slow touch, hushed confessions, and more public tenderness, like holding hands in town after a screening when the air smelled of popcorn and salt. An anonymous donor once offered a large unrestricted gift with the baffling condition of a Hall of Honor plaque in the projection booth. The board argued after meetings that smelled of coffee and worry. Would a glittering wall of names change the archives feeling into a sponsorship gallery? They negotiated a compromise, a modest donor display offstage, an annual public accounting of funds, and the donor's insistence on remaining anonymous. The resolution became a litmus test for values. Gratitude could be made transparent rather than performative. Years accumulated into a decade marked by a celebration that blurred ritual and memory. They projected a decade's worth of neighborhood reels on the side of the warehouse, set up folding chairs, and invited everyone who had ever been filmed. Malik ran the projector with the careful, reverent attention he had learned as a teenager. Nomi returned for a weekend workshop. Lucia sat small and beautiful in the front row, knitting and watching faces flicker like ghosts resurrected. They read the napkin aloud, not to be quaint but to make private agreements public. Prayers People wept and laughed, hands linked across rows. The ritual felt like blessing and governance in equal measures. On the way home, under string lights and the slow exhale of the sea, Aveline found an envelope tucked into the tin. It had no return address, it smelled faintly of cedar and seawater and carried a set of questions that might be welcome or dangerous. She delayed opening it, choosing instead to fold the napkin into the tin and press her palm against the metal, as if to warm it. The harbor would answer in tides and returns. Their pact would be tested and perhaps renewed. In quieter weeks, the archive ran listening nights, sessions where neighbors brought boxes and sat in a circle while volunteers digitized tapes and the room practiced communal witnessing. These nights insisted on care. Consent forms read aloud, tea offered, a facilitator prepared to pause when memories became heavy. Often, neighbors stayed late to share stories: the seamstress who never married, a couple who met on breakwater rocks, an abandoned warehouse turned into a dance hall in the 1960s. The archive's role was less curatorial than custodial. Holdings were returned with context, and subjects were offered a seat at any screening that used their footage. They also started an outreach program for schools called Micro Legacies, a 2-week summer course where students learn to use cheap cameras, to ask respectfully, and to build small archives for family elders. The course's first cohort made a short about a bus driver's daily rounds. The bus driver cried when his life became visible to him in the dark. The program secured a small grant and became a model for nearby community groups. The archive's pedagogy, consent, context, public return, diffused into practice beyond its walls. As the archive matured, so did Aveline and Mateo's capacity for difficult conversations. They rehearsed performance of hard news, how to tell a subject that footage could cause pain, how to advise a fellow on ethical edits, how to refuse a funder politely but firmly when language about market-ready stories slid into their grants. Each refusal required a new conversation about sustainability. They learned to say no in ways that invited other forms of help: equipment loans, microgrants, community partnerships, because survival required creative integrity as much as it required money. A winter came when multiple things broke at once: the van's transmission, a projector lamp, and a suddenly revoked small grant. The group met with a blunt honesty. Volunteers could not be stretched thin. They needed paid stipends for basic sustainability. They launched a local patron drive that asked neighbors to pledge small monthly amounts. The campaign worked, not because of a viral headline, but because people kept returning. It was a litmus test in the same currency the archive valued: returns, not click metrics. The archive's ethics practice deepened. They created a consent coach role and offered training to other community groups on trauma-aware interviewing and on how to host screenings where subjects could opt out of broadcast if they needed more processing time. They also partnered with a small mental health collective to be present at certain screenings that involved painful histories. These innovations made their model more resilient and more humane. Romance kept flowering in small, stubborn ways. They celebrated anniversaries not with expensive dinners but with curated reels, a homemade compilation of their first year projected onto a blank wall. Mateo would sometimes weld a tiny makeshift lantern and leave it on the windowsill as a joke. And promise. Aveline learned to knit, and she made him a scarf that he wore when the nights got thin. They marked each other's small victories: an accepted grant, a repaired projector, with a ritual toast of tea and a kiss that tasted like ceremony. In later years, the archive's influence loosened a small amount of pressure on the city's cultural agenda. Other neighborhoods started their own listening nights. A local journalism cooperative borrowed their fellowship's selection principles to ensure community representation in reporting. A regional fund included their consent guidelines as part of a best practices packet. It was not dominance, it was gentle replication. Methods spreading like a warm rumor. The decade mark party felt like an honest comet. Brief, bright, and with a wake that lingered. The projection stretched the neighborhood into a shared history, and the tin, the napkin, passed from hand to hand until it returned to Aveline. The envelope remained unopened in the tin, a weight of possibility. Their pact had weathered tests. Appropriation, scarcity, loss, compromise. They had not always chosen perfectly, but they had learned to choose together, and when choice becomes practice, it becomes a kind of love. At the end of the long night, the harbor's lights soft as a promise, Aveline and Mateo walked home with palms warm, a tin in a coat pocket, and the habit of asking folded into their steps. The harbor did not soothe their flame. It taught them how to carry it without burning those they loved. They kept asking, and the city kept answering in returns and in people who came back, again and again, with reels and stories and the slow hunger to be seen. Doubled length edition. The narrative has been expanded with additional scenes, sensory description, community moments, and private tenderness to reach approximately double the original word count while preserving the original storyline and conclusion. Aveline's childhood returned to her in texture and image. She had grown up in a house that smelled of sea spray and lemon polish, where the radio was almost always on and adults spoke in gentle parentheses around the sharp facts of living. Her father had taught her patience, how to wait for tide and for truth, and her mother had taught her to notice small details. The way a photograph's edges yellowed, the peculiar curve of a neighbor's smile. Those lessons turned into a vocation. She loved archives because they allowed time to be kind, instead of erasing. An archive invited accumulation, careful handling, and the slow return of what had been thought lost. Mateo's hands remembered labor the way a musician's hands remember chords. He had learned how to fix things not because he wanted to be useful but because he wanted to restore agency to broken objects, film reels that clicked and coughed back to life under his patient care. When he was a child, his grandmother had taught him to talk to old machines the way other people talked to plants, with steadiness and the belief that attention was a kind of nurturing. That belief informed how he treated people too. He listened in a way that made others feel known. "Remember when we almost gave up?" Mateo asked once. "I remember," Aveline replied, "but I remember more the people who refused to let us." They laughed, then became serious, and the laughter sounded like an agreement. One late afternoon, while rain made ribs of the sky, Aveline and Mateo sat on the archive steps. "Do you ever worry we'll fail?" she asked, not in a way that needed reassurance but in a way that invited honesty. "All the time," he said, and then added, "But failure is not what scares me most. It's silence. If these reels go unread and no one remembers to replay them, it's like a language losing speakers. I don't want that for us either." She leaned her head on his shoulder and listened to the tiny, steady noise of the generator in the back room. They did not solve the worry. They tended it like a plant, watering with small promises and regular routines. "Then we'll keep talking to them," she said. "We'll find others who'll translate the language back into living rooms. Leto, the fisherman, brought in a brittle sleeve of film one day and told them a story about a knot no one taught anymore. He had discovered the footage while cleaning a trunk and had come to the archive because he believed the past deserved curiosity, not judgment. The archive team watched with him as the film showed a market that had nearly disappeared. Leto pointed at the screen and named faces. Each identification was a small act of rescue. Afterwards he sat with Aveline over cups of tea and explained the names of nets and how to mend a tear properly. They listened, and in listening they learned a line of craft that connected reels to livelihoods. A young volunteer, Noor, walked in with a trembling hand and a box labeled home. Inside was a reel that contained a birthday party from 1997. Noor had never seen her mother at 19 until that evening. In the grainy footage she was laughing, alive in a way Noor had only heard about. After the screening, Noor cried, soft, uneven sobs, and then laughed, and then called her aunt. The archive had given her a small, practical inheritance, the knowledge that her mother had once been a person beyond the present sorrow. Their mornings became a collage of small rituals. Mateo would make coffee and set 2 mugs on the table with a gentleness that suggested ceremony. Aveline would sort through a pile of film leaders and hum until a tune became a shorthand for ease. They kissed in hallways, slow and steady, more like punctuation than performance. There were afternoons when they would sit on the roof and let their hands find each other in a wordless conversation. Fingers looping, thumbs brushing, the intimacy of small contact that required no detail. Screenings became protocols of care. The archive developed space for conversation and pause, for people to step out if a reel triggered a raw memory. The team wrote preface notes for certain reels, contextualizing scenes so that when difficult footage played it would be framed with empathy. They added a listening circle after certain shows where participants could speak without interruption. This change was not mandated by law nor by grant. It was a choice rooted in respect and in the recognition that film could be reparative if handled with attention. At the Harbor Festival, they set up a small booth and projected neighborhood reels on a suspended sheet. The night smelled of fried dough and salt. Children wove through adults and elders sat on folding chairs and commented on fashions from decades past. Aveline and Mateo walked through the crowd with linked fingers, not making a show but making a statement. They were partners in public and private, committed to the archive and to each other. In the projection light, their faces looked soft and worn in a way that made them look like townspeople whose work mattered. Applying for a grant became a test of their partnership. Late nights at the table with pens and printouts revealed small differences. Mateo wanted to be candid about need. Aveline insisted on the language of stewardship and community voice. They argued once about wording and paused to breathe, then wrote in turns. The pause became an opportunity to practice patience. He traced a finger along the margin and she read aloud. Their collaboration demonstrated that even bureaucratic labor could be an act of intimacy when shared. Sometimes Aveline would leave early and walk alone along the docks, letting the harbor talk to her. She carried questions like pebbles in her pocket and found herself turning them over under her palm until edges softened. In such walks she rehearsed what she might say at screenings and to Mateo if storms found them. Rehearsing was not cowardice but preparation. She loved Mateo not because he was flawless but because he kept returning, like the tide, showing up with patience and a steady willingness to repair. They taught children how to handle film exactly to cup a reel like an ember, to avoid bright lights, to listen to the click of a projector. With respect. A small boy named Thomas returned every week and learned how to thread a projector. Eyes wide with concentration. Mateo would kneel beside him and guide his hands. Aveline would explain the stories hidden in frames, the slow grammar of community life. Thomas learned to call the project ours, and so the archive's future felt less precarious. They developed a language of jokes that functioned like glue. Mateo pretended to misplace his glasses, and Aveline would find them on his head. She would retaliate by swapping the sugar for salt once and then apologize with a ridiculous paper crown. Laughter became a method of recovery after difficult conversations and a way to mark ordinary days as celebratory. Years folded into a rhythm that was both intimate and civic. They planned for an uncertain future with practical tenderness, a file cabinet for wills, notes on conservation methods, the meticulous labeling of objects so that memory could travel. They spoke of aging not in fear but as the next chapter to steward together, promising to keep the archive's door open and to keep their small rituals alive even when bodies grew slower. On in ordinary evening with a milky moon and a wind that smelled faintly of pepper, Aveline and Mateo sat watching a reel of a child's birthday on a grainy projector. They held hands, neither required excitable declarations. Their partnership had matured into a companionate devotion, urgent sometimes, quiet often, always deliberate. In the dark with the projector's hum, they were content to let images roll, a decade of seams visible in the light, and to rest in the steady truth that they had chosen a life that kept looking back kindly. They had spent years learning the grammar of staying, how to set punctuation in times of sorrow and joy alike. But one autumn, after a long day of cataloging reels and convincing a skeptical funder to respect consent, they found themselves alone in a heat that did not belong to the season. The generator hummed, a window had been left open and the sea's breath moved through the archive like a slow hand. Aveline leaned against the workbench where Mateo had been tightening a projector bulb and watched the way light broke against the metal. There was a hush that felt almost like a held question, a waiting with kindness. He set the tool down and reached for the scarf she had knitted him years ago, making a small, theatrical show of winding it around his throat and then loosening it again. She laughed, a low sound that answered the room rather than invaded it, and something loosened between them like a seam unpicked, in order to be restitched more carefully. Later, with the lights low and a reel of local dances running in the little screening room, Aveline and Mateo let the hum of images fold them inward. They ate nothing, but their mouths found one another in the way neighbors find a shared path through an unexpected storm. Their motions were patient, not hurried, each touch in investigation rather than an imperative. He tasted like tea and salt and the faint metallic tang of solder, and she tasted like wool and lemon polish, the two of them a map of the city's flavors. They kissed as if rehearsing promises that did not need names, kisses that learned the weather of one another's skin by degrees. Aveline remembered the rules they had written in a napkin, and laughed because even vows could be made gentle and domestic. He took her by the waist and they moved toward the old archive couch whose cushions had been replaced twice and patched more often than the van had been. The couch held them like a willing audience as they undulated through memory and want, each touch catalogued with the careful language of consent they used at work. She told him where to be gentle, and he listened as he always did, not because he was perfect but because he had made listening into a craft. The air in the little room thickened, not with shame but with a rounded expectation that felt almost ceremonial. They explored each other's landscapes in a hush, punctuated only by the projector's small mechanical breath. There were moments when they paused to name a pleasure aloud, as if naming could fold it into permanence rather than expose it. They made a practice of slow exhalations and small check-ins, a habit that turned their nights into something more like a rehearsal for tenderness than a single performance. Aveline ran her fingers along the line of Mateo's collarbone, tracing a cartography of small, lived troubles and gladnesses. He shivered at a memory of a childhood storm and let her stay with him in the feeling rather than dismissing it. This willingness to inhabit each other's pasts was its own form of eroticism, the intimacy of reciprocal shelter. Afterwards they lay with foreheads touching and the projector's light painting slow stripes across their knees. She reached for a pen and, laughing softly, added a little amendment to the napkin pact. When tempers fray, return with tea and a piece of music, then speak in 5 sentences that begin with I remember. He agreed, though he wrote a mock objection and folded it into the tin, the ritual retrieving its capacity to make compromise playful rather than resentful. It was not extravagance that defined them but the accumulation of small agreements that prevented erosion. The steamy evenings were interwoven with the archive's less glamorous needs. They repaired spools together, hands greasy with lubricant and empathy, and argued about microphone placement while their shoulders leaned as if for warmth. They argued about whether to screen a reel that contained a painful confession, negotiating harm reduction on the fly, and looking for ways the community could be protected without erasing truth. Those conversations, threaded through with desire and frustration, became a secret liturgy that deepened their bond. They learned how to forgive quickly because the work demanded it, but they also learned how to ask for apologies without making them into debt. Seasons turned. Donors came and went and sometimes returned with apologies and sometimes with new requests. One winter a blizzard swept the harbor and stranded them in the archive for 3 days, snow pressing like a white thumb against the windows. They lit a stove and made a stew from ingredients scrounged at the market. Their bodies warmed and then warmed again as they slept on the floor beneath quilts and the projector hummed in a companionable half-dream. In those small trials their love felt less like a spectacle and more like a skill set, a useful and reliable capacity that allowed them to endure and to keep offering hospitable space to neighbors. In the spring, a visiting filmmaker came through with a suitcase full of footage shot during protests years before. The reels were jagged with grief and hope, and when Mateo threaded the projector the room held its breath. Aveline sat beside him and felt the old political anxieties twitch in her chest. The filmmaker watched with a trembling gratitude for the care the archive showed. After the screening, the filmmaker stayed to teach a workshop on ethical storytelling, and the archive's fellowship program grew roots in unexpected places. They hosted late-night conversations about complicity and memory and felt the strain of negotiating differing views while also keeping the tender center intact. Those nights often ended with Aveline and Mateo walking the jetty, the sound of waves like a lesson in scale and humility. Their bedroom became a catalogue of small metamorphoses. A lamp fixed by Mateo, a scarf moth-eaten but beloved, a postcard of a town that neither of them had visited but both loved imagining. They woke up to each other's breathing, and those ordinary mornings felt like the anchor to everything else. Every so often they would stagger through a disagreement like a storm-beaten boat and then, equipped with their 10-minute cool-down ritual, return with clearer language and fewer accusations. They gave each other the grace to be human and the insistence to be kind, a balance that often felt harder than any grant. Application. Sometimes their passion arrived sharp, other times it was slow as tide. On a day when the sea shone like a coin and the archive screens were busy with children learning to thread projectors, they stole away to a small cove where the town's fishermen mended nets. They moved under a canopy of salt-tangled sky and did not speak, letting the world melt into the business of being together. There they explored new places in one another, sometimes with breathless laughter, sometimes with a solemnity that regarded the other's pleasure as a state secret to be protected. Months later, a misunderstanding over a submitted file threatened a larger breach. Aveline had presumed something about a fellow's consent and announced an editing plan that Mateo found too public-facing. They fought with the force of fatigue and principle, voices sometimes raised before they remembered that raising voices hurt everyone. After the storm, their ritual of 10-minute cool-downs saved them from saying things that might be impossible to repair. They sat later on the roof and let the harbor's night hold them in its slow attention while they reconstructed what had gone wrong and promised new check-ins in their workflow to prevent a repeat. The incident left them better equipped to navigate conflicts that were both personal and structural. The archive matured, and with that maturity came mentorship. A younger couple arrived, whom Aveline and Mateo took under their wing, teaching them how to mediate community screenings and how to read consent as a living practice rather than a checkbox. As mentors, they showed patience, demonstrating by example how to turn friction into craft and how to scale kindness when resources were thin. Their mentorship was a way of multiplying their own care, a small legacy of practices that might outlive them as stewards of place. On the occasion of an exhibition that honored longshore workers, Aveline and Mateo curated a sequence that told not just the story of industry, but also the private joys of those who worked the docks. The exhibition moved people to tears and celebration. It was the kind of public recognition that tasted like a slow victory rather than a headline. After the opening, they slipped away into the archive and made love among stacks of labeled boxes, the scent of old paper mingling with the sharpness of their passion. Their bodies learned new ways of communication, a hand on a lower back to indicate direction, a hum to signal consent, a small squeeze that reassured without words. Those nights were tender and ferocious in equal measures, and afterward they would leave a note for the volunteers thanking them for anything they'd missed. Time pressed on in ways both subtle and profound. Aveline's hair threaded with silver at the temples and Mateo's hands bore lines that told of years of careful use. They adjusted to aging with a humor that made the community laugh and an intimacy that deepened. When Mateo's knee began to ache more often, they adapted by lowering shelves, adjusting work rhythms, and instituting a Tuesday afternoon siesta for those who needed it. The archive learned to be more durable because their caretakers were learning to be more deliberate. One temperate evening, an envelope that had waited in the tin for years finally got opened. It contained a letter from an old friend who had moved away early in Aveline's life and who now wrote to say that she had watched their archive grow from afar, and that she wanted to add her family's reels to their collection. The message was a quiet benediction and a reminder that their project had radiated outward in ways they had not always seen. They celebrated with a modest dinner, toasting with cheap wine and a cake that had been slightly burned but swallowed with gusto. They had learned to measure abundance in presents rather than balance sheets. As they grew older, they planned not for retirement but for succession. a rotating fellowship that would ensure the archive's values would be taught and not dissolved as the years shifted. They trained people in oral history methods and in a pedagogy that valued listening over spectacle. The project that had once been a labor of two became a network of modest, stubborn caretakers who understood that memory kept requiring attention. And through it all, Aveline and Mateo maintained the tiny scaffolding of their private rituals: daily tea at 2 a.m., weekly no-work night, a yearly screening of their first reels for friends who had watched them become. In the end, when the harbor's light seemed to hold more stories than the sea itself, Aveline and Mateo were still making small amendments to their pact on napkins in the archive. They were older, yes, and weathered, but their eyes still found one another like magnets across a crowded room. They had learned that sustained tenderness is not a single bright event but an accumulation of small, generous acts: the making of a scarf, the offering of tea, asking permission, and hearing the answer. They had made a home inside a project and a home inside one another, and those homes kept returning the stories they sheltered in ways the two of them could not have predicted when they first met beneath the cafe's crooked awning. The archive endured because a community kept coming back, and because two people decided to keep asking one another what it meant to stay. They stayed in the work and in each other, learning again each day how tenderness endures. The archive breathed because their love refused to fade, shaping a home where memories could rest without fear. In the quiet glow of the harbor, they kept choosing one another, and the city kept answering with light.